Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about album number 14 from Tangerine Dream, Le Parc. Alright, so this marks yet another new phase in the story of Tangerine Dream. Last time I talked about their Hyperborea album, which was the final album they released while signed to Virgin Records before their contract expired and they split off. Shortly after this point, the band found a new home on the label Jive Electro, and initially things seemed like they'd just be picking up from where they left off as they released a pretty well-received live album called Poland in 1984 to kick off their time with the label in the era which would become known as the Blue Years. But they followed that up with their first studio album on the imprint here in 1985, also marking the final TD studio album to feature contributions from Johannes Schmoling before he would split off just like Peter Baumann did before him. And right off the bat, something feels not quite right. The theme and structuring of this project is very different from any other previous TD project. First of all, every track on this thing is named after various parks around the world. Central Park in New York, Tiergarten in Berlin, Hyde Park in London, etc. Surprisingly ordinary imagery to be associating with a band who might typically tie their music to legends and mythology or loose concepts about space or the future. But not to mention, instead of the usual collection of a small amount of lengthy winding pieces you'd ordinarily expect, Le Parc's track listing consists of 9 tracks, all but one of which range from about 3 to 5 minutes, and the last of which is just over 6 minutes. It seems to be specifically presenting itself as something that can be more easily digestible by a mainstream audience. And boy, when you hear the music itself, does that impression really cement itself. While a lot of the musical ingredients that go into this project are logically carried over from what they did on an album like Hyperborea, the compositions are way more pop-friendly than anything else they've ever done, with far brighter, major key melodies and a lot of blaring synth imitation horn sections that were kind of in vogue at that point in the mid-80s. If the tracks weren't all instrumental, they almost feel like they could fit in that regular mainstream radio format at the time. As you might guess, this is a really divisive one with fans. And fans can argue any number of previous TD albums were a sellout in some manner that was too commercial for their liking and turned them off from the band, be it Exit, or Tangram, maybe even Stratosphere depending on who you ask. But Le Parc is the first album in their catalog where the sellout argument can't really be written off or ignored in any way, because that's just literally what this is. Le Parc isn't just a move for more pop-friendly structures in the same vein as Exit that still maintains the same futuristic vibe as their other albums from that era and stands as its own unique thing. Just the sound and production of this one feels way more mainstream friendly and dated to the trends of this specific time, to the point where it feels like something is actively lost in the transition, where outside of a couple moments, TD just don't even sound like TD anymore. Does that mean it's bad? Well, not necessarily. I mean, I have long made the arguments that sellout albums don't always inherently equate to being worse, and Le Parc, despite the drastic shift for the band sound that it represents, still definitely has its fans, people who do still really jive with all the retro 80s pop and occasional mild new age leaning aesthetics of it. I mean, minor spoilers, I do think there is one album of theirs slightly later in their catalog that explores pretty much the exact same sound palette and aesthetic as this, that I still have distinctly positive-leaning memories from listening to it in high school, though we'll get to that in another video. Le Parc is not that album for me. I remember hearing this project once in high school and thinking, ooh, I don't know about this one. When I first announced this series, I went in fully expecting this to be the one that I would mark as my least favorite out of the 16 albums which I'll be dedicating full videos to, and yeah, it is. White Eagle gets the edge over this, since that album, despite how redundant it felt in the greater context of their catalog and there being nothing on that album that wasn't done significantly better on a previous album, that was just TD sticking to the sound they were known for, and just by merit of there not being a huge market for instrumental synth projects of that style in 1982, they could kind of get away with it. Once we've gotten to 1985, there's really nothing cutting edge about a project that sounds like this. It's way more of just a product of its time. But at the same time, I mean, Le Parc isn't that far behind White Eagle for me. Coming back to here for this video, it was a little better than I remembered. Like, there's a running joke I've seen among a couple of fans who spell this album's titles 2 words backwards to get L crap. And, okay, I wouldn't go so far as to say this album is outright crap. Like, what the sound of this album reminds me of more than anything is this one little album you may have heard of that came out about a year after this one, Jean-Michel Jarre's Rendezvous. The specific synth palette, the bombastic production style, and even a lot of the compositions on Le Parc sound pretty dang similar to the kind of stuff you'd find on that album, especially the track Fourth Rendezvous. And hey, I'm a big fan of Jean-Michel Jarre, as I think we know pretty well at this point. Rendezvous is a really solid album, and I can't complain about the similarities to a project like that, especially when this came out first. But it's also so obviously clear that Le Parc is nowhere near as good as Rendezvous. It's the diet version of that album at best. Rendezvous was an album all about feeling big and important. It was an album that felt like it was about Jean-Michel Jarre, the worldwide superstar, trying to bring the whole world together with his massively impressive synth productions and million-selling shows. It's the kind of album that you hear and immediately understand that the guy making it is a big deal and means business. Le Parc, meanwhile, is anything but big or important. It's a freaking album about parks. These tracks don't have any kind of grand ambition or sweeping scale to them. They feel like tourism ads. So, I guess an album like this would therefore have to lean really hard on the lead hooks and melodies to be able to lift itself off the ground and become something special. And, I mean, you know, albums like Tangerine and Exit are proof that these guys had the ability to pull that off. But as I kind of alluded to when I covered those albums, poppy melodic hooks are pretty much a core strength of Exit and Exit alone that isn't really repeated elsewhere, and their compositions, on average, tend to have a lot more of a tendency towards flighty mood pieces. And that's kind of what Le Parc ends up being for the most part. A lot of bland 80s mood pieces, lacking good enough hooks to stick with you in a meaningful way. Not to say they're not trying to nail those hooks at all. I mean, the hooks are fine. But you're never going to hear a melody as instantly sticky as Fourth Rendezvous. Right from the very beginning, the album gets off to a rough start in its opener, Bois de Boulogne, Paris. Much like how White Eagle threw me off in its opening with a track that started out sounding almost exactly like Charanzan. This album's opener shows them doing an even more blatant self-rip-off of their track Pilots of Purple Twilight. Just a very simple rearrangement of the exact same chords, played on the exact same keyboard tones, with, I guess, a little more of a standard 80s backbeat. I guess it does technically have one of the more memorable hooks in the bunch, but it's still clearly nearly not as memorable as the track is trying to build off of. And it's a real shame that this is easily the track that best recaptures the kind of energy that TD used to have on their previous albums. A track like Central Park, New York is more indicative of the kind of thing you're actually going to hear on this album, with all those 80s synth horns, 80s synth kalimbos, and more stock percussion that all sounds very familiar to so many productions from that specific era. Even if the bass lines and plucking chords are solid enough and provide some decent energy. Gaudi Park, Güell Garden Barcelona is probably the track here that most readily resembles Fourth Rendezvous, and I guess it's not doing that sound poorly with its sweeping synth strings that seem to evoke more of a sense of scale. But again, the hook and energy behind the track is not nearly as well done as Fourth Rendezvous, and the percussive elements in particular sound even more generic to this era than before. Speaking of generic, moving further into the album, The Cliffs of Sydney might be this album's lowest point in that department. Like, its lead chords being played on these 80s guitar textures, and the melodies totally blend into everything else here without really having much of a hook at all. I guess it's cool how the 80s guitars are made to sound like the same keyboard and synth tones as all the other ones they use. They might just be keyboards imitating 80s guitars, and they blend well enough into the mix to not bother me. But still, the composition behind everything is so damn bland and whitebread that it's hard to express any kind of emotion about it, besides boredom. Less boring is the closer, Yellowstone Park. They do try to include some more interesting instrumental textures like Asian flutes and pianos and strings, and I'm all for that, even if the Asian flutes sound kind of like stock sound effects. But what really holds this track back for me is a vocal appearance from Claire Torrey of all people, sort of mimicking her performance from Pink Floyd's Great Gig in the Sky. As legendary as a singer as she is, I feel like the addition of her vocals here is doing more to make this track sound like a standard 80s ballad and feel even less special than it would have otherwise. The kind of thing that feels like it's a step away from being the kind of thing that Whitney Houston could sing "I Will Always Love You" over. And that's just not the kind of thing I want to hear out Tangerine Dream. I really hope that isn't foreshadowing anything that might be coming later for them. That's not to say this album is all bad, though. There are some tracks I ended up liking in spite of the genericness of the sound palette. Zen Garden Ryōan-ji Temple Kyoto was a somewhat refreshing, more experimental-leaning moment for the album. The way its minimal synthplex and Asian strings going over lonely ambient pads all come together reminds me of what I enjoyed in Hyperborea. And there's a nice little wordless semi-operatic female vocal performance from Katja Brown Eyes. Sorry for butcher pronunciations. She's kind of in the background, and it just adds just enough subtle texture to deepen the composition, but also not feel intrusive like Claire Torrey's appearance on The Closer did. And hell, there's 2 tracks right after that which were able to nail down good enough melodic hooks to stick the landing for me. The title track has more of that Fourth Rendezvous energy, and the melodies, while again predictably not nearly as sticky, do feel fittingly triumphant. The track has a lot of propulsive energy to make up for it. This apparently acted as the theme tune to a short-lived TV show called Streethawk, and yeah, that tracks. But my favorite track here is probably Hyde Park, London. It may have all the same generic 80s beats and synth tones you'd expect from throughout the album, but it just happens to have what I feel to be the most memorable melodic hook in the bunch, especially those parts that have those descending pan flute melodies. Do 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 do. Yeah, my favorite part of this album is played on pan flutes. I don't know what to tell you. I'll still take the one genuinely good hook as it comes. I also go back and forth with Tiergarten Berlin, whether that's a good track or my least favorite track here. In one breath, it's probably the most musically complex piece here and features more movement within its chord progression and even a few classical-inspired cadences. I do have to appreciate on that front, but on the other hand, it's also the sappiest and most saccharine thing this band has ever come up with up to this point by a long shot. The way it's played so straightforwardly on those electric keyboards and the flute-y synth melodies that join in at other points make it feel like any number of generic love ballads like you'd hear on the radio at the time. Some chord changes this track goes through have me like, oh, that was kinda cool, in a way that no other track here does. And other chord changes have me like, oh, this is so overbearingly sweet it makes me want to throw up. I'm inclined to give it a little bit of a pass because it reminds me of some of those warmer and more emotional moments on that one part of Tangram, but man, did they find a way to make something like that feel more sellout-y than ever before. But that's everything on Le Parc. Look, for all I've shit on this album and how generic it feels, I never at any point felt like what I was hearing was outright distasteful or an active turnoff. All of it was perfectly pleasant to have on in the background, and there's nothing offensive here. There's certainly nothing shocking or off-putting about it either, maybe aside from the minor vocal appearances. This is a pretty logical progression of the direction they'd already been continually going in since Johannes Schmoling came on board. The album is by no means terrible, and if you're just looking for a straightforward instrumental synth-pop record that really obviously sounds like it came out in the mid-80s, I don't see any reason this couldn't work for you. Again, it has its share of fans and defenders. I can see the appeal if this particular 80s aesthetic is really your thing. And heck, I think it wouldn't take a ton of tweaking for the kinds of sounds they explored here to result in something I could more easily get into. But man, it's such a limp and forgettable record, one that really sanded away all the more daring or forward-thinking edges of TD's sound that got me interested in them in the first place. And the fact that it's so commonly cited as a point at which fans got fed up with the band and left them behind definitely tracks. It's not the worst thing you'll ever hear, and if you ever choose to go past 1986 in their catalog, you might find they can do even worse. But it is very inessential, and the first really obvious sign that these guys were on the downswing. It's definitely a letdown, and out of those first 16 studio albums that I'm focusing this series on, I do feel this is the weakest. And I'm overall feeling a 5.5 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.